A parking lot outside a shopping center. A DE agent lies on the asphalt, bleeding from 4 gunshot wounds. His weapon is gone. His badge is gone. He has 1 minute to live. 20 feet away. 2 men in tailored suits and silver skull-tipped boots. One is pinned between 2 cars, legs crushed, still conscious. The other is walking toward the agent with an axe. Not a gun, an axe. Because a bullet would be too quick, too merciful. This agent took something from them, and they want him to feel every second of what comes next. But here is what makes this moment impossible to explain. These 2 men, Marco and Leonel Salamanca, are considered the deadliest assassins in the Juárez Cartel. They have never failed a contract. They move in perfect silence. They kill without hesitation and without emotion. They crawled through the desert on their hands and knees to pray for this mission. They sat on their target's bed while he showered, close enough to hear the water running, and waited. They had every advantage, every weapon, every opportunity. And their target was not Hank Schrader. Their target was Walter White, the chemistry teacher, the one who betrayed their cousin Tuco, the one whose face they pinned to a shrine of Santa Muerte, the saint of death. So, how did the deadliest assassins in Mexico end up dying in a parking lot, trying to kill the wrong man? How did Walter White redirect them, without ever speaking to them, without ever facing them, without them even knowing his hand was behind their destruction? The answer reveals something more dangerous than any cartel hitman. It reveals the fatal weakness, hiding inside absolute certainty. The cousins never spoke a word to Walter White. They did not consider him worthy of their voice. He was beneath them, a dying schoolteacher. A man so insignificant that acknowledging his existence would be an insult to the Salamanca name. That contempt, that silence, that unshakable confidence in their own superiority. It blinded them. And by the time they understood what Walter White really was, one brother had a bullet through his skull, and the other was being erased in a hospital bed. This is the investigation into how silence became a death sentence. How the most dangerous men in the Southwest were outmaneuvered by a man they refused to see, and how Walter White turned their own certainty into the weapon that destroyed them. To understand how the cousins fell, we need to go back to the beginning, back to Mexico, back to the moment they crawled through the dirt and sealed their fate. The Salamanca cousins were not ordinary criminals. They were raised to be weapons. Their uncle, Hector Salamanca, was one of the founding members of the Juárez Cartel, a man who built an empire on blood and fear, a man who understood that loyalty was not taught through love, but through pain. When Marco and Leonel were children, still young enough to fight over toys, Hector taught them a lesson they would never forget. Leonel complained that Marco had broken his toy. He said the words that children say without thinking. He said he wished his brother was dead. Hector did not yell. He did not lecture. He simply grabbed Marco by the back of the neck and forced his head under water. He held him there. Leonel screamed, begged, tried to pull his uncle's arm away. But Hector was unmovable. He watched Marco thrash and struggle, watched the bubbles rise to the surface, watched until Leonel was hysterical with terror. Only then did he release Marco, and as both boys gasped and sobbed, Hector spoke the only words that mattered. La familia es todo. Family is everything. From that moment forward, the cousins understood. Blood was sacred. Betrayal was unforgivable. And anyone who harmed a Salamanca would answer for it. They grew into something terrifying. Identical twins who moved in perfect synchronization, who communicated without words, who dressed in tailored suits and cowboy boots tipped with silver skulls. A signature that became legendary in the cartel world. When you saw those boots, you knew death had arrived. Vince Gilligan, the creator of Breaking Bad, described exactly what he needed when casting these characters. He said, "We knew we were going to have these very scary, very silent Mexican cartel assassins. We needed guys whose expressions and eyes told us a lot. And that is what made them so effective. They did not threaten, they did not negotiate, they did not speak. They simply appeared, and people died." The migrant in the truck recognized them instantly. He had been bragging about his connections to Michoacan gangsters, about the cars he painted for criminals back home. He thought he was impressive. Then he saw the skulls on their boots. His voice stopped mid-sentence. His face went pale. He knew exactly who was sitting across from him. Moments later, everyone in that truck was dead. The driver tried to run. They shot him in the back. Then they set the vehicle on fire and walked away without looking at the explosion. This was not rage. This was not passion. This was routine. But their mission in America was not routine. This was personal. Their cousin Tuco was dead, shot by a DEA agent named Hank Schrader during a confrontation in the desert. Tuco, who Hector had mentored like a son. Tuco, who represented the future of the Salamanca operation north of the border. And before Tuco died, there was a man who betrayed him, a man who cooked methamphetamine for him, then turned against him, a man the cartel knew only as Heisenberg. The cousins did not know his real name. They did not know where he lived. They only knew that he had to die. So they went to the one person who could help them, their uncle Hector. The old man sat in a wheelchair at Casa Tranquilla nursing home. A stroke had taken his voice, his movement, everything except his mind and one finger. He could not speak. He could not write. He could only ring a small bell, but that was enough. The cousins brought a Ouija board. Lionel moved his finger across the letters, and Hector rang his bell at each one. WALTER. WHITE. When the name was complete, Hector rang his bell furiously. His eyes burned with hatred. This was the man who destroyed Tuco. This was the man who had to pay. The cousins had their target. They tracked Walter White to his home in Albuquerque. They studied his routine. They waited for the perfect moment. And then they let themselves inside. Walt had broken into his own house through the crawl space. He was covered in dirt and cobwebs. He decided to take a shower. While the water ran, the cousins entered his bedroom. They sat on his bed. One held an axe. The other waited in silence. They could hear him. The shower, the movement. He had no idea they were there. They were seconds away from completing their mission. And then a phone buzzed. A text message. One word. Polos. The cousins looked at each other. Then they stood, walked out of the bedroom, and disappeared. Walter White stepped out of the shower, toweled off, and never knew how close he had come to death. The question that haunted investigators, that baffled everyone who studied this case. Why did they leave? Who sent that message? And what kind of man could call off the deadliest assassins in Mexico with a single word? The answer would lead to a manipulation so elaborate, so perfectly constructed, that the cousins would die without ever understanding they had been played. And Walter White would never have to lift a finger. The man who sent that message was Gustavo Fring, owner of Los Polos Hermanos, respected businessman, generous donor to the DEA charity fund, and secretly the most powerful drug distributor in the American Southwest. Gus had built his empire on patience, on discipline, on the ability to see 3 moves ahead while everyone else was still reacting to the first. He had watched Walter White cook methamphetamine with 99.1% purity. He had seen the product that no other chemist could replicate. And he understood something that the Salamancas could not. Walter White was worth more alive than dead. But Gus had a problem. The cousins were not his employees. They answered to the cartel, to Juan Bolsa, to Hector Salamanca. And the Salamanca family had a code that superseded business, superseded logic, superseded everything. Blood must be repaid by blood. Tuco was dead. Someone had to answer for it, and the cousins would not stop until that debt was paid. So Gus did what Gus always did. He manipulated. The cousins showed up at Los Polos Hermanos and sat in a booth. They did not order food. They did not speak to the employees. They simply sat there, staring, for the entire duration of the restaurant's operating hours. The next day, they came back. Same booth, same silence, same unblinking stare. An employee asked Gus if she should call the police. He looked at the cousins and said, "They are doing nothing wrong." But Gus understood the message. They were done waiting. They wanted Walter White. And if Gus did not give them something, they would take what they wanted anyway. So he arranged a meeting. The desert outside Albuquerque, sunset. Gus stood facing the cousins with Juan Bolsa mediating. Bolsa explained the situation clearly. Tuco Salamanca had been like a son to Hector. He was a key man in cartel operations north of the border. He was loyal. And then this Heisenberg, This nobody betrayed him. The Salamanca family wanted vengeance. The cartel supported them. Blood had to be spilled. But Gus was calm. He looked at the cousins and asked a simple question. This man, Heisenberg, he may have betrayed your cousin, but is he the one who pulled the trigger? The cousins said nothing, but Gus could see them processing. The man who killed Tuco Salamanca, the man who actually shot him, is a DEA agent. His name is Hank Schrader. Marco spoke, one of the only times he ever used his voice. He said Hank Schrader was law enforcement, that Bolsa had forbidden them from targeting anyone in the DEA, that killing a federal agent would bring heat on the entire cartel. Gus nodded. Bolsa controls what happens south of the border, but north of the border, I decide what is permitted. He paused. Let the weight of his words settle. The agent's name is Hank Schrader. May his death satisfy you. In that moment, Gus Fring redirected 2 cartel assassins away from his most valuable asset and toward a DEA agent who happened to be Walter White's brother-in-law. But Gus was not done. He was playing a game with multiple outcomes, and he intended to win no matter which way the pieces fell. If the cousins killed Hank, the DEA would launch a full investigation. They would focus on the cartel, on the Salamancas, on Juan Bolsa, and Gus. The quiet businessman with the charity donations and the clean record would be invisible. But there was another possibility. What if Hank survived? Gus knew something the cousins did not. Hank Schrader had been suspended from the DEA. He had surrendered his weapon after assaulting Jesse Pinkman. When the cousins came for him, he would be unarmed. An unarmed DEA agent against 2 of the deadliest hitmen in Mexico. The outcome seemed certain. But Gus did not survive 20 years in the drug trade by leaving outcomes to chance. He made a phone call. Not to the cousins, not to Bolsa, not to anyone in the cartel. He called Hank Schrader. The voice on the line was electronically disguised, unrecognizable. It delivered a simple message. Listen carefully. 2 men are coming to kill you. They are approaching your car. You have 1 minute. 1 minute. 60 seconds to understand the threat, to find a weapon, to prepare for 2 assassins who had never failed a contract. Gus was giving Hank a chance, not because he cared about Hank's life, but because he wanted the cousins to fail. He wanted them dead. The Salamanca family had been a thorn in his side for decades. Hector had killed his partner Max, shot him in the head right in front of him, while Don Eladio laughed and watched. Gus had waited years for revenge, and now he saw an opportunity to eliminate 2 more Salamancas without ever being connected to their deaths. If the cousins killed Hank, Gus would benefit from the chaos. If Hank killed the cousins, Gus would benefit from their elimination. Either way, Gus won, and Walter White, the man the cousins had traveled 1,000 miles to eliminate, would never know how close he came to death. He would never know that Gus saved his life, and he would never know that his brother-in-law was about to pay the price for his survival. The cousins prepared for their assault. They purchased bulletproof vests from an arms dealer. They tested the vests by shooting the dealer point blank in the chest. When he survived, they bought 2 and walked away. The dealer also offered them a special bullet, a hollow point round nicknamed Black Death. He said the bullet had 6 razor claws that expanded on impact, that it would cause catastrophic damage to any target. The cousins declined the ammunition. They only wanted the vests. But Marco took 1 bullet. A free sample. He slipped it into his pocket without thinking. That single bullet, the one he almost left behind, would determine everything. The parking lot of a shopping center. Midday. Ordinary people walking to their cars with groceries and shopping bags. Hank Schrader sat in his vehicle, holding a bouquet of purple flowers for his wife Marie. He had just left a disciplinary meeting. His badge was suspended. His gun was confiscated. He was unarmed and alone. Then his phone rang. The voice was distorted. Electronic. Impossible to identify. Listen carefully. 2 men are coming to kill you. They are approaching your car. You have 1 minute. Hank looked around the parking lot. He saw nothing unusual. No threats. No suspicious figures. He thought it was a prank, but something in his gut told him to pay attention. He scanned the area again, checking mirrors, looking between cars. And then he saw them. 2 figures in suits, moving through the parking lot, walking directly toward him, silver skulls on their boots. Hank's training kicked in immediately. He had no weapon, no backup, no time to call for help. He had 60 seconds, and the only thing he could use was his vehicle. Lionel appeared in his rearview mirror, approaching from behind, gun raised. The first shot shattered the rear window. Glass exploded into the cabin. The second shot hit Hank in the arm, but Hank was already moving. He threw the vehicle into reverse and slammed the accelerator. The vehicle rocketed backward, directly into Lionel. The impact was devastating. Lionel was crushed between Hank's vehicle and the car parked behind him, his legs pinned and shattered. He dropped his gun into the back of Hank's vehicle. One cousin down, but Marco was already firing. Bullets tore through the driver's side door. One hit Hank in the side. He scrambled across the seats, grabbed Lionel's fallen gun, and tumbled out through the rear door. He was bleeding badly, shot at least twice. His vision was blurring, but he was alive, and now he was armed. Marco shifted Hank's vehicle into neutral, releasing his brother. Lionel was conscious but immobile. His legs were destroyed. He looked at Marco and whispered in Spanish, "Finish him." Marco nodded and began hunting. He moved through the parking lot with mechanical precision, following the blood trail that Hank was leaving behind. A bystander saw him coming and froze. Marco shot him without breaking stride. This was not personal. This was simply efficiency. No witnesses, no complications. He found Hank crouched behind a car, bleeding out, barely conscious. Hank raised Lionel's gun and fired. 1 shot, 2 shots, 3 shots, 4 shots, 5 shots. Every single round hit Marco directly in the chest, and Marco did not fall. The bulletproof vest absorbed every impact. He barely flinched. He looked down at his chest, then looked at Hank, and almost smiled. He raised his weapon and fired twice. 1 shot to Hank's chest, 1 shot to his abdomen. Hank collapsed. The gun fell from his hand. Empty. He lay on the asphalt, staring up at the sky, waiting for the final bullet. But Marco did not pull the trigger. He stood over Hank for a long moment. This DEA agent had killed his brother's legs, had resisted when he should have died quietly, had made this harder than it needed to be. A bullet to the head was too easy, too quick. This man deserved to suffer. Marco turned and walked back toward the car. He was going to get his axe. This decision, this moment of arrogance, would cost him everything. Because while Marco walked away, Hank's eyes caught something on the ground. A bullet. A single bullet that had fallen from Marco's pocket during the firefight. The hollow point round the arms dealer had called Black Death. The free sample that Marco had taken without thinking. Hank could barely move. His hands were shaking. Blood was pooling beneath him. But he reached for that bullet. He picked up Lionel's empty gun, and with the last of his strength, he loaded the single round into the chamber. Marco returned with the axe. He walked toward Hank with the confidence of a man who had never lost, who had never failed, who had killed dozens of people and never once faced real resistance. He raised the axe above his head, and Hank pulled the trigger. The hollow point entered Marco's face just below his left eye. The 6 razor claws expanded on impact, exactly as the arms dealer had promised. The back of Marco's skull exploded. He was dead before his body hit the ground. The axe fell beside Hank, close enough to touch, but never swinging down. In the distance, sirens. Hank lay on the asphalt, bleeding from 4 gunshot wounds, surrounded by shell casings and broken glass. Marco lay beside him, missing half his head, and 20 feet away. Lionel was still conscious, still breathing, still staring at his brother's body with something that might have been disbelief. The deadliest assassins in Mexico, defeated by an unarmed DEA agent in a parking lot. But this was not the end of Gus Fring's plan. Lionel survived. He was rushed to the hospital. Both of his legs were amputated above the knee. But he was alive, and he was conscious, and he knew things. He knew that Gus had authorized the hit on Hank. He knew that Gus had redirected them away from Walter White. He knew enough to destroy Gus Fring's entire operation. So Gus made another move. He personally delivered fried chicken from Los Pollos Hermanos to the police officers standing guard at the hospital. He smiled and shook hands and played the role of the generous community businessman, while the officers were distracted, eating chicken and thanking Gus for his kindness. Mike Ermentrout slipped into Leonel's room. He carried a syringe. Leonel saw him coming. He recognized Walter White through the window, standing with the other cops, watching. He ripped the tubes from his arms. He tried to crawl toward the door, dragging himself across the floor, trailing blood from his severed legs. But he could not escape. Mike delivered the injection, walked out calmly, disposed of the syringe in a nearby trash can. Minutes later, Leonel Salamanca went into cardiac arrest. He was pronounced dead shortly after, both cousins eliminated. The Salamanca family lost 2 of its deadliest weapons. Gus Fring removed 2 threats to his operation, and Walter White, the original target, never even knew the role he played. He never spoke to the cousins. He never faced them. He never had to, because Gus did everything for him, and that is the pattern that made Walter White so dangerous. He did not defeat his enemies directly. He created situations where others did the work for him. The question is, how? How did a chemistry teacher understand power well enough to survive against the cartel? And what does the cousin's failure reveal about the psychology of certainty? The answer lies in a cognitive bias that psychologists have studied for decades, a bias so powerful it can turn the greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses. Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, spent decades studying how humans make decisions. He discovered something that changed our understanding of the mind. He found that confidence and accuracy are not the same thing, that the people who feel most certain are often the most wrong, and that this pattern is so consistent, so universal, that he called it the most significant of all cognitive biases. He called it overconfidence. Overconfidence is not arrogance, it is not ego, it is something deeper, something built into the architecture of human thinking. It is the tendency to believe that your knowledge is more accurate than it actually is, that your predictions are more reliable than they actually are, that your abilities are greater than they actually are. Studies have shown that when people say they are 90% certain about something, they are wrong nearly half the time. Their confidence has no relationship to their accuracy. And here is what makes this bias so dangerous. The more skilled you are, the more experienced you are, the more successful you have been in the past, the more vulnerable you become to overconfidence. Because your past success convinces you that your judgment is reliable, that your instincts are correct, that you can trust what you feel to be true. The Salamanca Cousins had never failed. Every contract completed, every target eliminated, every mission accomplished without resistance. They had walked into rooms filled with armed men, and walked out leaving only bodies behind. They had hunted enemies across borders. They had killed in broad daylight and disappeared without a trace. This history of success created a psychological certainty that became invisible to them. They did not question their abilities because their abilities had never been questioned, and when they looked at Walter White, they saw nothing that challenged their certainty. A 50-year-old chemistry teacher, diagnosed with lung cancer, no criminal record, no combat training, no connections to the violent world they inhabited. He was so far beneath them, so utterly insignificant, that they did not even consider him worthy of their voice. This is where overconfidence becomes something more specific, something psychologists call illusory superiority. Illusory superiority is the tendency to overestimate your own qualities while underestimating others. To believe that you are smarter, more capable, more important than objective reality would support. It is why 93% of American drivers believe they are better than average, which is mathematically impossible. It is why most people believe they are less biased than others, while demonstrating the exact biases they deny. The Cousins suffered from a profound case of illusory superiority. They were predators. They had always been predators, and Walter White, in their eyes, was prey. Weak prey, dying prey. Prey that did not deserve the honor of their attention. This contempt was not a strategy. It was a reflex. It was how they processed a man who did not fit their mental category of threat. And this is exactly what made them vulnerable, because Walter White understood something they did not. He understood that perception is a weapon. When people underestimate you, they do not prepare for you. They do not guard against you. They do not see your moves coming because they are not watching for moves at all. Walter White never confronted the Cousins directly. He never had to. He simply existed in their blind spot and let them destroy themselves. But he was not the only one who understood this principle. Gus Fring had built his entire empire on the psychology of perception. He presented himself as a humble businessman, a fast food manager, a community volunteer who donated to law enforcement charities and shook hands with DEA agents at fundraising events. No one suspected him. No one investigated him, because nothing about his appearance triggered the mental category of drug lord. Gus understood that the most dangerous position is the one nobody is watching, and when he redirected the Cousins toward Hank Schrader, he was exploiting the same bias that had protected him for 20 years. The Cousins accepted the redirect because it made sense to their worldview. Hank Schrader had pulled the trigger. Hank Schrader had killed Tuco. Hank Schrader was a legitimate target for their vengeance. They did not question why Gus was offering this information. They did not wonder what Gus had to gain. They did not consider that they might be pawns in someone else's strategy. Because questioning requires humility, and the Cousins had none. This is where the research becomes truly disturbing. Psychologists have found that overconfidence is resistant to correction. People who are shown evidence that their confidence is misplaced often become more confident rather than less. The bias protects itself. When the Cousins sat on Walter White's bed, close enough to kill him in seconds, and then received the text message that pulled them away, they should have asked questions. Why was Gus protecting this man? What made a dying chemistry teacher valuable enough to shield from cartel assassins? What were they missing? But they asked nothing. They simply redirected their focus to the new target and continued forward. Their certainty was so complete that it filtered out any information that might challenge it. This pattern appears throughout history. Military commanders who ignore intelligence because it contradicts their battle plans. Business executives who dismiss market signals because they conflict with their strategy. Political leaders who surround themselves with voices that confirm what they already believe. The Cousins were walking into a trap designed specifically for minds like theirs. Gus knew they would not question the redirect. He knew they would not suspect his motives. He knew their overconfidence would carry them straight toward their own destruction. And he knew one more thing. He knew that if he warned Hank Schrader, gave him just 60 seconds to prepare, the outcome would be uncertain. The Cousins were deadly, but they were not invincible. Their strength had always been surprise, silence, the psychological paralysis they created in their victims. Take away the surprise, and they became vulnerable. Hank Schrader was a trained federal agent. He had survived firefights before. He had instincts honed by years of dangerous work. Given 1 minute of warning, he had a chance, and that chance was all Gus needed, because Gus was not gambling on one outcome. He was creating a situation where every outcome served his interests. If the Cousins killed Hank, the investigation would focus on the Salamancas. Gus would remain invisible. If Hank killed the Cousins, Gus would eliminate 2 enemies without lifting a finger. Either way, Walter White would survive to keep cooking. The blue methamphetamine would keep flowing. The money would keep coming. This is the chess game that the Cousins never knew they were playing. They thought they were hunters. They thought they were in control, They thought their skill and their reputation and their history of success made them untouchable, but they were pieces on someone else's board, and the man moving the pieces understood psychology better than they ever could. There is a term in psychology for what happened to the Cousins. It is called the bias blind spot. The bias blind spot is the tendency to recognize cognitive biases in others, while failing to see them in yourself. To believe that your own thinking is clear and rational, while everyone else is distorted by error. The Cousins could have looked at Walter White and seen a man using perception as a weapon. They could have recognized that his apparent weakness might be a disguise. They could have questioned why Gus Fring, a man known for his strategic brilliance, was protecting this particular target. But they did not, because they could not see their own blind spot. And that blind spot, shaped by years of success and reinforced by every kill they had ever made, led them directly into a parking lot ambush they should have anticipated. Marco died with an axe in his hand, reaching for a brutal kill he thought was guaranteed. Lionel died in a hospital bed, erased by the same organization he thought he was serving, and Walter White, the man they had traveled 1,000 miles to destroy, never even knew their names. Let us return to the parking lot, to the moment when Marco Salamanca walked away from a wounded DEA agent to retrieve an axe, because a bullet was not painful enough. This decision took approximately 30 seconds, 30 seconds to walk to the car, 30 seconds to grab the weapon, 30 seconds of absolute certainty that his victory was complete. In those 30 seconds, Hank Schrader found a bullet on the ground, loaded it into an empty gun, and prepared to fire the only shot he would get. Marco returned with the axe raised above his head. He looked down at Hank with the expression of a man completing a routine task. There was no urgency, no concern, no recognition that anything had changed. He did not notice the gun in Hank's hand. He did not notice that it was now loaded. He noticed nothing, because he had already decided how this would end. And that certainty, that unshakable belief in his own dominance, kept him blind until the hollow point round entered his skull. This is the anatomy of overconfidence. It is not a single mistake, it is a pattern of mistakes, each one invisible to the person making them, each one building toward a conclusion that feels inevitable only in hindsight. Marco's first mistake was accepting Gus Fring's redirect without question. His second mistake was assuming that an unarmed DEA agent posed no real threat. His third mistake was choosing brutality over efficiency, wanting to use an axe when a bullet would have ended things immediately. Each mistake flowed from the same source: the belief that he was in control, the belief that his judgment was sound, the belief that his experience had prepared him for every scenario. But experience can be a trap. When you have succeeded many times, your mind begins to treat success as the default outcome. You stop preparing for failure because failure feels impossible. You stop questioning your assumptions because your assumptions have always been correct. The Cousins had eliminated targets far more dangerous than Hank Schrader. They had survived situations far more complex than a parking lot ambush. They had every reason to believe that their skills would carry them through. And that belief was exactly what destroyed them. Now consider the other side of this equation. Hank Schrader had 60 seconds of warning. He was unarmed. He was alone. He was facing 2 assassins who had never failed a contract. By every objective measure, he should have died. But Hank did not suffer from overconfidence. He suffered from the opposite. He had just been suspended from the DEA. He had just surrendered his weapon. He had just faced the possibility that his career was over, that everything he had built was crumbling. He entered that parking lot in a state of uncertainty, doubt, vulnerability. And paradoxically, that vulnerability saved his life, because Hank did not assume he would win. He did not trust his instincts to carry him through. He fought with the desperation of a man who knew he was outmatched, who knew that every decision could be his last, who knew that overconfidence was a luxury he could not afford. He used his vehicle as a weapon because he had no gun. He grabbed Lionel's dropped pistol because he needed anything he could find. He searched the ground for ammunition because he had no other options. Every move was improvised. Every decision was reactive. Every action was driven by the knowledge that he was fighting for survival, not executing a plan. The cousins fought like men who expected to win. Hank fought like a man who expected to die. And in that difference, the outcome was decided. This pattern appears again and again in studies of conflict and competition. Researchers have found that underdogs frequently outperform expectations, not because they are secretly more talented, but because they approach challenges without the burden of certainty. They prepare more carefully. They consider more possibilities. They remain alert to threats that confident competitors dismiss. The cousins dismissed Hank Schrader. They dismissed Walter White. They dismissed any scenario in which their dominance could be challenged. And that dismissal created the opening that destroyed them. Now let us examine what this cost. Marco Salamanca, dead in a parking lot. Half his skull removed by a hollow point round that he himself had carried into the fight. Leonel Salamanca, legs amputated, confined to a hospital bed. Eliminated by lethal injection while police officers ate fried chicken in the hallway. The Salamanca family lost two of its most effective enforcers. Hector Salamanca lost two nephews he had raised from childhood. The cartel lost two weapons it could never replace. And what did they accomplish? Nothing. Walter White continued cooking methamphetamine. His product continued flowing through the Southwest. His empire continued growing. He never faced justice for betraying Tuco. He never answered for his role in their cousin's death. He never even acknowledged that the cousins had existed. They died for a vendetta that achieved nothing. But the cost extended beyond the Salamanca family. Hank Schrader survived, but he was not the same man. 4 gunshot wounds, months of surgery and rehabilitation, a period where doctors feared he might never walk again. The psychological damage was even worse. Hank had always been confident, brash, the kind of agent who kicked down doors and made jokes about danger. He had built his identity around being the toughest person in any room. After the shooting, that identity shattered. He became paranoid, anxious, unable to leave his house without feeling like targets were painted on his back. He lashed out at his wife Marie. He refused visitors. He collected minerals obsessively, desperate for something he could control. The man who walked into that parking lot never fully returned. And here is the darkest irony of all. Hank was not the target. He was a substitute, a redirect, a consolation prize offered by Gus Fring to protect the man the cousins actually wanted. Hank nearly died, not because of anything he had done to Walter White, but because he was related to him by marriage. Because his existence was useful to Gus Fring's strategy. Because he could be sacrificed to protect a meth cook. He never knew this. For years, Hank believed the cousins attacked him because he killed Tuco. He believed it was cartel revenge, simple and direct. He did not know that Gus had manipulated the entire situation. He did not know that Walter White was the original target. He did not know that his brother-in-law's secret life had nearly cost him everything. That revelation would come later, and when it did, it would destroy whatever remained of their relationship. But in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, Hank knew only that he had survived something he should not have survived, and Walter White knew only that a threat had been neutralized without any effort on his part. He received a phone call from Gus Fring shortly after the attack. Gus calmly explained that the surviving cousin was unlikely to live, that the situation was being handled, that Walter should focus on his work and not concern himself with cartel matters. Walter asked Gus directly whether he had known about the cousin's plan, whether he had done something to intervene. Gus's response was carefully constructed. He said that he believed there were some things Walter was better off not knowing, that, in this business, certain matters were handled in certain ways, that Walter should be grateful the threat had passed, and leave it at that. Walter understood. He understood that Gus had protected him, that Gus had eliminated the Cousins, that Gus had done something to ensure his survival. He did not know the specifics. He did not know about the 1-minute warning. He did not know about Mike's injection in the hospital room. But he knew enough, and this knowledge created a debt, an obligation, a sense that he owed Gus Fring his life. This debt would define their relationship for the next 2 seasons. It would give Gus leverage over Walter. It would make Walter hesitate to challenge or defy the man who had saved him, until it did not. Until Walter decided that debts were for ordinary men, that gratitude was a weakness he could not afford, that Gus Fring, like everyone else who underestimated him, would eventually learn what he was capable of. But that confrontation was still in the future. In the present, the Cousins were dead. Hank was recovering, and Walter White continued cooking methamphetamine with 99.1% purity. The silent assassins who crawled through the desert to pray for his death never even got close enough to speak to him, and that silence, the same silence they used to intimidate their victims, became the symbol of their failure. They had nothing to say to Walter White, and in the end, Walter White had nothing to say to them. The Salamanca Cousins were perfect killers. They had the training, the reputation, the resources, the complete dedication to their mission. They crawled through the desert on their hands and knees to pray for success. They studied their target. They entered his home and sat on his bed while he showered, close enough to hear him breathing. And they failed completely. Not because they lacked skill, not because they were unlucky, not because their enemies were stronger or faster or better armed. They failed because they could not see what was right in front of them. Their certainty blinded them. Their contempt for Walter White made them dismiss him as a threat. Their faith in their own abilities made them ignore the warning signs. Their history of success made them believe that failure was impossible. And when Gus Fring redirected them toward Hank Schrader, they accepted it without question, because questioning would require doubt, and doubt was something the Cousins had never experienced. This is the lesson that Breaking Bad teaches again and again. The most dangerous enemies are not the ones who look dangerous. Tuco Salamanca was loud and violent and terrifying. He beat a man to death with his bare hands for speaking out of turn. Everyone knew he was a threat. He lasted 2 seasons. Gus Fring was quiet and polite and invisible. He shook hands with DEA agents and donated to charity and ran a chain of chicken restaurants. No one suspected him for 20 years. Walter White was a dying chemistry teacher in khaki pants. He looked like someone's disappointing father. He looked like a man the world had forgotten, and he outlasted them all. Because appearance is not reality. Because perception is a weapon. Because the person you dismiss, the one you consider beneath your attention, might be the one who destroys everything you have built. The Cousins never understood this. They operated in a world of physical dominance, a world where strength was visible and threats were obvious, a world where silver skull boots and silent stares were enough to paralyze anyone. But Walter White did not live in that world. He lived in a world of manipulation, of strategy, of understanding how people think and using that understanding against them. He never needed to fight the Cousins. He never needed to face them. He simply needed to exist in their blind spot and let someone else do the work. Gus Fring understood this principle perfectly. He had used it for decades to build an empire that no one could see. And when the Cousins became a problem, he used it to eliminate them without leaving fingerprints. 1 phone call, 1 minute of warning, 2 dead assassins. That is the mathematics of psychological warfare. Now consider what this means beyond the world of Breaking Bad. Overconfidence is not a fictional concept. It is one of the most documented phenomena in psychology. Daniel Kahneman studied it. Researchers at Stanford and Harvard have measured it. Business schools teach entire courses on recognizing and avoiding it. And yet, it persists. Executives make decisions based on certainty they have not earned. Military commanders ignore intelligence that contradicts their assumptions. Investors bet everything on predictions that feel true but are not. The bias is universal, it affects everyone. And the more successful you have been, the more vulnerable you become. Because success feels like evidence. It feels like proof that your judgment is sound, that your instincts are reliable, that you can trust what your mind tells you. But success in the past does not guarantee success in the future. And certainty, no matter how complete it feels, is not the same as truth. The Cousins walked into that parking lot believing they were invincible. They were wrong, and their wrongness cost them everything. This is the warning that their story offers, not just for cartel assassins, not just for criminals and killers, but for anyone who has ever felt certain about something and stopped questioning whether that certainty was deserved. The most dangerous moment is not when you are afraid. Fear keeps you alert. Fear keeps you humble. Fear keeps you searching for threats. The most dangerous moment is when you are confident, when you believe you have already won, when you stop looking for ways you might lose, when you dismiss the possibility that someone weaker, someone smaller, someone you consider beneath you might be the one who takes everything away. Walter White understood this. He spent 5 seasons being underestimated by drug dealers, by cartel enforcers, by the DEA, by his own family. And he used that underestimation as a shield, a weapon, a strategic advantage that protected him until the very end. The Cousins never spoke a word to him. They did not consider him worthy. And that silence, that contempt, that absolute dismissal of a man they should have feared, it was the last mistake they ever made. So the next time you feel certain about something, the next time you look at someone and decide they are not a threat, the next time your confidence tells you that victory is guaranteed, remember the Salamanca Cousins. Remember the silver skulls on their boots. Remember the axe that never swung down. And ask yourself a simple question. What am I not seeing? Because the answer to that question might be the only thing standing between you and destruction. The Cousins were not defeated by Walter White. They were defeated by their own minds. And that is a fate that awaits anyone who mistakes certainty for truth. But Walter White's manipulation of the Cousins was not his most sophisticated work. It was not even close. Because there was someone else. Someone who trusted him completely. Someone who believed in him, defended him, loved him like a father. Jesse Pinkman thought he was the street-smart one. He thought he understood the game. He thought that loyalty meant something. He had no idea what Walter White was doing to him. For 5 seasons, Walt systematically dismantled Jesse's life using psychological techniques so precise, so devastating, that clinicians now study them as textbook examples of abuse. That investigation begins next.